I'm a Postmates delivery driver based in Northwest Las Vegas, NV. I've seen some weird shit. I was browsing this sub and I came across the old posts by the guy from the US Forest Service Search and Rescue, talking about all the weird stuff he's seen and heard over the course of his career. I've been running Postmates here for a while now, and I can guarantee that rural areas do not have a monopoly on bizarre and creepy shit. I thought I would share some stories of what I've seen on the job. For clarity, I live in the Las Vegas, Nevada suburb of Centennial Hills on the outskirts of the city. I deliver around there, in Summerlin, and in North Las Vegas and the inner city near downtown. I work the night shift often because there's less competition for offers. The first thing that you'll notice if you hang out in the outskirts of Vegas at unconventional hours is all the beat-up cars that are sitting around empty at every dead end directly facing the desert. If you don't believe me, go to one of these roads in a residential area near or after nightfall and you'll always see at least one of them just sitting there, with no reason. They're never there in the daytime, and they are always facing away from the desert toward the city. Some of them I've seen idling with the lights on and no one inside the vehicle. To this day, I have never met anyone who has been able to tell me what those cars are doing there or who they belong to. One time I was delivering McDonald's to an apartment complex and accidentally ended up on the wrong floor. A middle-aged white guy, one of those types that looks really tough without you really being able to tell why, answered the door. He took one look at me and said, "Is it done?" I thought he meant the food delivery, so I was like, "Yep, here you go." He gestured toward the burger bag. "So the proof's in there?" Surprised the mess isn't leaking out. At this point I was weirded out enough that I glanced at my phone and realized I was at the wrong address, and I promptly turned around and bolted without saying anything. I suppose I'm lucky that there were some other people walking around the apartment lot at the time. If there weren't, I suspect I would have gotten shot before I made it to my car. I was out in the early morning, about 1:15 in the morning, coming back from a delivery in the lots near Lone Mountain, where there are large abandoned fields of dirt which separate the gigantic mansions. When I saw a huge blaze of light in the middle of one of the fields, I pulled over to see what it was, and it turned out that there was a huge SUV on fire. No one else was around, just me and the burning car. I decided I'd call 911 and report it. I told the responder what was happening, and the location of the lot. He sighed. "This isn't a number for prank calls, buddy. Tell your friends to knock this shit off. It's been long enough." Then he hung up. I was baffled as to what this reaction was about, but I decided to keep moving. Exactly 4 months later, I'm coming back from the same delivery along the same route, and lo and behold, I once again see the burning SUV, in the exact same position as before. Checked the time, and sure enough, it was 1:15. I mentioned later to my mom that this happened, and she was surprised. She said she'd seen a van burning in that lot late at night, 10 years ago. Suffice it to say, I avoid that route at that time of night now. One Sunday afternoon, I took a large delivery from a natural smoothie place to one of the giant houses at the edge of Summerlin. For those unfamiliar with Vegas districts, this is where the really rich, well-connected people live. I don't really remember what the place looked like, but I know it was practically a mansion. A young woman in her early 20s opened the door. She was strikingly attractive, and she was wearing a tight-fitting white dress. I was obviously turned on a bit, but there was also something a tiny bit unsettling about her. She smiled and asked me if I could put a delivery bag in the kitchen. I followed her into the house and noticed that everything was bright, clean, and immaculately polished. The kitchen was a little ways into the house, and it adjoined the living room. In the living room there were 2 white couches, one of them empty and the other containing 5 more women, all unbelievably beautiful and all wearing the same white dress. I set the bag on the kitchen counter and turned to the woman who'd greeted me at the door to get the all clear. I found her, staring at me, smiling. She was just so entrancing that I returned the stare, gazing into her eyes. "Now you want to sit down on the couch," she said serenely. As she said it, I remember that an intensely pleasurable feeling started coursing through my body. It was from her. I sensed her eyes, her words. I had to follow them. After that, I don't recall anything. My next memory is driving down Charleston Boulevard several hours later. I didn't feel any different. But that night I did notice that there was an odd bruise on the back of my neck, with a tiny skin blemish I didn't have before in the center of it. Months later, the bruise is gone, but I still have the blemish. Being horny makes me dumb. I'm ashamed to say that I've tried to revisit the house on several occasions since, but I legitimately can't remember anything about where it was located, and I've never been able to find it again. A few months back around 10 p.m. I got a ping for a restaurant that was miles from where I was, which usually signifies an order that no one else wants to take. It looked like an easy pickup and drop-off, so I was a bit confused as to why no one wanted to take it. I take literally every order that comes my way, so of course I accepted. The pickup was at this quaint little diner on Decatur Boulevard, which looked like it had been there since the 80s at least. I was in and out of there quick, and nothing really seemed problematic or off. The drop-off was close nearby, on a street filled with ancient, sprawling one-story homes. It was a decaying house with several dead trees in the front yard. It looked like no one had taken care of it for decades. Granted, that's par for the course in some of the older districts of Vegas, but the strangest thing was that the lots on either side of it had been completely razed. There'd been houses there once, that much was clear, but not any longer. There was nothing like that anywhere else on the street that I saw. Every other lot was filled. I had a feeling in the pit of my stomach that I shouldn't go up to the door, but the delivery had to be completed or I'd get in trouble with corporate. I went up the walk and knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again harder. No answer. I figured I'd call the number attached to the order before I just left it there. It rang a few times, then picked up. There was silence for a few seconds and then a click, and the call ended. At this point I was completely ready to nope out of there, so I put the food on the doorstep and turned to leave. I had made it halfway down the walk when I heard the door creaking open behind me. I turned to see who was there. There was no one. The door stood open, revealing a dark and dilapidated hallway which looked even more decrepit than the rest of the house. It extended back further than the light would allow me to see, but I had the distinct feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the end of the hallway. When I made it back to my car I was literally shaking. All I wanted to do was go far away from whatever was in that hallway. I didn't take any more orders that night, and I didn't get any sleep either. In the morning I decided to call the number again to see if anyone would answer. It had been disconnected. I have plenty more stories, if you all want to hear them at another point. Let me know any questions you have in the comments and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. He was scared of rabbits. We didn't listen. When I was in elementary school, I moved from my inner-city apartment across the country and into a tiny little town, into an even smaller little cul-de-sac. My dad promised I would grow to love my new home and make new friends, but I had to make an effort to really experience it. At the time, I thought he was full of shit, but I did as all little kids did, and I stopped caring. I started playing outside and promptly made a group of friends, who lived in the same juncture of houses as I did. We established a fort at the edge of the woods, behind Torrance's house, and began our routine of tag and chase, Nerf wars and hide-and-go-seek championships. Among sunny afternoons, I found best friends and forgot there ever was a time before. Nearly a year after I had moved into town, another kid and his family moved in down the street. My friend group adopted him as one of us, and we continued on as normal. It didn't take us long to figure out there was something weird about this kid though. One particular rowdy game of tag was ceased temporarily by a chorus of shouts about a rabbit in Jackson's yard, prompting each of us to turn and look at its unmoving form. Even as kids, we could tell something was wrong with it. Jackson was the most bothered of all of us, fidgeting nervously and begging us to go somewhere else. He didn't want to look at it. He even attempted to actively avoid acknowledging it was there. Some of the boys thought it'd be funny to grab him and make him look, holding his head still and trying to pry his eyelids open with childish giggles. None of us expected Jackson to erupt into screams, crumpling to the ground as he began to sob fearfully. We all stepped back and watched as some of our parents poked their heads out and rushed over, swarming us with questions and demands to know what happened. My mom swiftly grabbed me by my ear and dragged me back towards my house, chastising me the whole way for being such a terrible friend. She sent me to my room, and within minutes the street was deserted of any kids. My dad came in a bit later and apologized on my mom's behalf, asking about the rabbit we had seen. Animal control was called, and the rabbit was swiftly removed. We weren't allowed outside for the next few days. In the coming weeks, we learned that Jackson wasn't just afraid of that rabbit having a disease or something. Jackson was terrified of rabbits in general. The mere mention was enough to get him sweating and begging for a topic change, and that paved the way for the years of bullying he had to endure. I felt bad. A lot of us did. We played as we normally did at home and none of us bullied him. But a lot of the kids at school did. All the way through middle school he was tortured day in and day out. It got to a point where the bullies actively targeted anyone who dared associate him, ending most of his friendships, including ours. After that, I stopped paying attention to Jackson, or Rabbit Boy as he was dubbed. Occasionally a story would float around about something he said or another meltdown he had, but as all of us got older, his bullies stopped paying him attention. Maybe they got bored, maybe they realized that they were being assholes for no reason. I didn't care. I practically forgot about Jackson until sophomore year, when we had a science class together. It started as being lab partners. We started talking again, because we needed to work on a project together, but our old friendship shone through, and soon enough we started hanging out full-time again. He was still kind of weird, but I learned to look past it. I remember specifically one day his mom pulled me aside and told me he had some mental issues he was working through, and it meant a lot to him that we were friends again. I felt bad for that kid. A huge part of me blamed myself for his issues, and made me work twice as hard to be nice to him. Junior year, 2 weeks before Easter, Jackson and I were screwing around in Walmart. We avoided the aisles stocked full of Easter-themed shit, the rabbit imagery, pretended Easter didn't even exist. It was all fine, and even though we saw kids with stuffed bunnies and chocolate rabbits, Jackson was able to keep it together. We left the store and as I unlocked my car, I noticed something strange, a flash of white towards the front of the store, from the exit we hadn't left through. A moment of squinting, one of realization, and several of panicking as I tried to goad Jackson to hurry up and get in my car. He got curious, started trying to find what I was looking at, but I finally managed to get him into the passenger seat and the car started. We pulled out, but then I realized the only way onto the main road was to pull out past the other exit. There was nothing I could do. I went as fast as I legally could without hitting anyone, but my efforts were in vain. Jackson noticed as we drove past. It was a man in a giant white rabbit costume. I still remember his screams of terror as I rushed home. I threw a hand out for him to grab onto. I kept trying to calm him down but I didn't know what to do. Probably stop the car, but I didn't think about that. We got to his house and sat in his driveway for what felt like hours. Just me and Jackson. When he calmed down I took him inside his place and hung out for a while because his parents were gone. We went back to his room and he asked me to stay the night. I had nothing better to do and I felt so bad, so I did. When his parents got home we moved to the family room and hung out for a bit. I remember the whole time I always thought something felt off. I didn't like Jackson's dad, didn't like the way he was looking at me, didn't like the way he acted. I was uncomfortable. I just wanted to go home, but I didn't feel right leaving Jackson alone. After dinner we went back up to his room and got ready to sleep. He made himself a pile of blankets on the floor and let me take his bed. I felt like I was being watched, but Jackson just shrugged and told me I'd get used to it. That weirded me out more. The whole day he had been talking cryptic and acting weird. I was getting tired of it. Finally, as Jackson brushed his teeth I risked a glance outside, surveying the edge of the woods. A flash of white in the moonlight caught my eye, and I felt nervous as I stared into the trees. I stared for what felt like forever, before I finally noticed a figure just beyond the edge of the tree line. I couldn't quite make it out, but I swore it was a rabbit costume. Shaking my head rapidly, I shut the blinds, bid Jackson good night, and went to bed. That morning I left as early as possible, and over the next few weeks I stopped hanging out with him. We would occasionally swap greetings, but it was clear we were no longer friends. I didn't want to be. After that, I moved on with life and started to forget all of this. I got a job, I moved out of my parents' house and into a small apartment closer to work. And I forgot. I bring all of this up now, because today I learned one of the most horrifying things I could possibly imagine. I flicked on the news as I got dressed for work, idly listening as I went through my usual steps of my morning routine. I almost didn't notice as the anchor began her next story, but one word caught me by surprise, pulling my attention to the screen. In the basement, an old and faded rabbit costume, presumably used to lure in his victims. She spoke excitedly, recounting the events earlier that night. A local man had kidnapped several kids in my town over the course of the year. When they raided his house, they found a horrible scene. 2 dead, 1 in critical condition, and 2 in mostly stable condition, all held in his basement. They sat on dirty mattresses, covered in shit, and left to rot in their own waste until he came to beat them or assault them. His basement was covered in rabbit memorabilia. Statues and pictures lined every shelf and wall. They found letters addressed to no one, describing in detail his grisly acts on not just these 5 kids, but several more. Bodies of various young ages were found in the woods behind his house. When I got home, I looked up the story to read more in detail. I learned things the news hadn't covered. He had a safe in his house the police had a hard time breaking into, but when they did, they were met with hundreds upon hundreds of pictures of kids, playing tag, doing chores, taking showers, even taking baths. Some of the less grim ones were up online for people to look through. They wanted to see if some of the kids could identify themselves. Morbidly curious, I shuffled through the stack and found some startling discoveries. Not only was I in the stack, I was in there a lot. I saw pictures of me getting off of the bus or playing outside, some of me washing my dog, all clearly taken from outside the home. But out of all of these pictures, only one truly scared me. One picture was of me looking out of the window of a vaguely familiar house, staring directly at the camera, and I knew right then and there that that was the night I had stayed over at Jackson's place. I called my mom up immediately and asked her if she had seen the news. We talked and talked as I scoured for details over the story. I wanted to know who this creep was, why he was so familiar. It didn't take long to figure it out. His last name was so familiar to me, only because Jackson shared it. All of those years of wondering why Jackson acted so weird, those nights being curious about his fear of rabbits, it all made sense. For years, Jackson had been telling us he was afraid of rabbits, and he was to an extent. But Jackson wasn't telling the whole truth. Jackson was afraid of rabbits because to him, they were monsters. All those years, all those nights, and it finally made sense. Jackson's dad was a monster no one else could see, because like a wolf in sheep's clothing, he paraded around in a harmless disguise. I think I'm scared of rabbits, too.